What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. I could not be more excited to be joined once again. It's been far too long with the one and only Ben Fennell. You can follow him on Twitter at BenFennell_NFL. Ben, how the heck have you been? Welcome back to the podcast.
I'm doing well. Everything's great in my life. Sitting here mid-December, just a few weeks from the holiday season. I know Packers fans, are maybe wishing this season had gone a little bit differently and have some painful weeks here to finish out. But it's the end of the season. A lot of time for reflection on things that have happened this year, and a new season, a new year is right around the corner. So there's optimistic times ahead for everyone inside and outside of this game, and it's a fun time. I hope your life is going well as well.
It's going great. As you mentioned, wish the season had been going a little bit better. I don't know if you know this, Ben. The Packers haven't lost in 2 weeks. They had the win against the Bears, the Chicago Bears, and they had a bye week. So they have gone undefeated in 2 weeks. So everything is sunshine and rainbows, and everyone is now looking at how the Packers are going to sneak into the playoffs with a 9-8 record. So
I haven't checked the analytics over the last 2 weeks, but your numbers seem to check out. We'll have to, move some things around, some metrics later on, but I trust you on that one.
We'll get the abacus out. We'll figure it all out, all the different scenarios. But what I really wanted to start with today is obviously you get a wide breadth of all the stuff that's going on in the NFL. You get to obviously go to games, cover games for CBS. You're obviously always on top of draft stuff, all the players in and out, all the trends around the league. I wanted to start off today, and we're going to get to a little bit of all of that, but what is your overall diagnosis of the 2022 Green Bay Packers? It clearly has not gone the way that they thought. I think the way a lot of us thought. It hasn't gone according to plan. What's your overall diagnosis of the 2022 team?
Well, certainly disappointment, and for a variety of reasons. I feel like defensively, it was a bit of a disappointment on the field, execution, scheme, getting the job done. I felt like they had adequate talent and experience in the right parts and all the critical places to perform. And we had high expectations. This defense would take not only a step forward, maybe 2 steps forward. So I think there's some defensive disappointment. And then collectively and, reflectively, offensively was a really poor plan going into the season. And I think you had some ingredients in the cupboard, and then it was time to make the meal, and you suddenly were missing a lot of flavor, and you didn't have some core parts of the dish, and you might not have had a dish for a week or two, and now you're looking for utensils and something to spice it up on the fly. And I just feel like the plan going into the grocery store and into the meal was askew and not the right plan, and I think that kind of unfolded as expected through September and October because of the poor preparation for the season. So twofold kind of there, a little defensively disappointed on the field with execution. And then offensively, I thought it was a really rough plan for 2022.
We'll definitely get to both of those things. I want to get to defense in a little bit, but I want to start with that second part that you mentioned, some of the ingredients for this team. It felt to me, and I don't even know that I necessarily disagree with the thought going in, but it clearly in hindsight has not worked at all. It felt to me like they went in saying, you know what? We know that this isn't a finished product. We know that some of these rookies are going to have to develop. We know that we're going to have to make a little bit of a transition of what kind of team we are in the field. No more Devontae Adams and things like that. But we think because we have Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, and this has been a team that's won 13 games in the past 3 seasons, every year under Matt LaFleur, we think that even if we can get by, 4-4 over the first 8 games, that by the time week 9, week 10 rolls around, guys like Christian Watson will be much better. Romeo Doubs will be much better. And to some extent, the second portion of that, what we're seeing now out of some of these guys like a Christian Watson, has come to fruition a little bit. It's just they, I think, overestimated the first part and the fact that, you don't just automatically get to 4-4 or whatever record you need to kind of wade things out until you get to the point of being ready on offense and having some of these guys come along. Those first few weeks and really like the first, third of the season was really, really rough. And this offense was not ready to go out and compete at a high enough level to win football games.
I think going into 2022, you have to really do a full self-scouting reflection on the previous 3 years, particularly the last 2 years of Aaron Rodgers being an MVP, because it wasn't your traditional MVP. And the thing I keep harping on is saying he was a game managing MVP in a QB friendly offense, a highly distributed offense that leaned on the run game. It was very foundationally built through scheme and through Matt LaFleur's system. Now, that's not to say Aaron Rodgers was just going through the motions. He had to execute. But this was an offense that was well designed for Aaron Rodgers to lean on the run game and get the ball out of his hands. And I call it a game managing because the offense was beautifully designed. And it wasn't the old Aaron Rodgers of extending the play and running around and doing all those things we saw early in his career. So the new style was surround him with parts and weapons and let him operate the system. So going into 2022, there was obviously a major setback to the parts around him. And so without the parts around him, then the system slowly gets fractured and creaked and cracked, and then you could poke it apart, and then you're trying to make changes and fixes on the fly. So I think it was super important for a team like the Packers, as there's other teams like this, the Eagles, the Jets, the Niners. There's certain schemes where it's very foundationally, built with your scheme and your offensive style and philosophy, and you better have some weapons everywhere because it's a distribution offense. Mike LaFleur runs that with the Jets. That's what Shanahan runs in the 49ers. That's what they're doing here in Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts, and there's weapons all over the field for these players. Just like in Green Bay the past few years, Aaron Rodgers found a lot of weapons. He created some weapons too. He created guys like Robert Tonyan and, Alan Lazard to a certain degree and MVS and guys like that. But I also just felt this was a bad offensive roster heading into the season. We can talk about the youth movement. You could talk about the unpredictable development of youth, which when you rely on youth, it's going to be turbulent. There's high variance for success of youth. Some show up right away, day one, and look the part. Some take a year, some take 2 years, some take 4 years, some take a second team, some take new coaching, some take a major rattle and shake in your career for you to wake up. And we've seen all that in Green Bay in different, varieties. So you can't expect youth to all develop and show up at the same time. There's going to be a guessing game, and you learn that on the fly. But the real issue is there are foundation players that you never once thought their job was up in the air. You never once thought, oh, should we replace him? That weren't performing up to standard this season. Incredibly inconsistent players. And that goes from guys on the O-line like Josh Myers. Inconsistent player. Good player. Wildly inconsistent in year 3. John Runyon Jr. Everyone expected him to be a guard starter. Wildly inconsistent player. There's some players on the Packers that may not be NFL starters. Josiah DeGuara, A.J. Dillon, Robert Tonyan, Amari Rodgers, Randall Cobb. Those are not NFL starters in today's standards. I hate to break it to you, Packers fans. Some of those guys are really good people. A.J. Dillon is a great human being. Unfortunately, I don't think he's a playmaking running back in the NFL.
He's not.
Same with Josiah DeGuara, Robert Tonyan. I know had 12 touchdowns. He didn't create a lot of those for himself, winning in man-to-man coverage and using his skill set. A lot of it was manufactured touches off the scheme and, schematically created openings, and he capitalized and caught the football. Great. He's not a traditional wide tight end. He's not an exceptional athlete. So what I'm getting at here is the plan for 2022 on the offensive side was too much dependent on youth. And then there were some cornerstone players that just did not develop and show up like we expected this season.
We talked about this a little bit on Twitter, I know as well, but we haven't had a chance to chat about it in person. But when you end up with a team of players that have a wide degree of variance and inconsistencies in their level of play, meaning that you could get an A or an F on any given day and on any given down, you can certainly easily, clearly live with a few of those players on your roster. If it was like, Quay Walker on defense and maybe like a, Josh or like a John Runyon Jr. on offense, right? If you had one guy on each side of the ball that has kind of that high variance of play, and some days you're going to get really good, some days you're going to get not so good, you can live with that. But when you've got a team full of high variance players, and I would say Darnell Savage and Eric Stokes, Rasul Douglas, Quay Walker, Devontae Wyatt, we could even go more on the defensive line. JJ Enigbare, on the offense, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr.
But then, Andy, when you have standards for players like Adrian Amos, Devondre Campbell,
Exactly.
guys like that aren't living up to it in combination with the young guys like the O-line. Yep. I mentioned Runyon and Myers. Well, that's on a line where we're trying to play Royce Newman and Josh Nijman, and the other 3 guys are incredibly volatile and trying to figure it out. So it's like the guys you come to expect to perform weren't performing.
Totally agreed. And when you have a whole team of those, and we know that like just if one of those players messes up on a given play, it can result in disastrous circumstances and huge plays or negative plays one way or the other. Now you've got like what can happen, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, is like on one play, 10 guys will be doing their job, and then just one guy messes it up. And then the next play, it's a different guy, and the next play, it's a different guy. And all of a sudden, you've got 40 plays, offense and defense, that just, maybe one or two guys messed up, but like it throws a wrench into everything you're doing. So I completely agree with you. Just extreme volatility and inconsistency by not only the young players, but some of the guys we've come to expect to lean on through the past few years for the Packers.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking ahead to the next few seasons and the state of this roster moving on, it's a fascinating kind of exercise to dive into what this team's going to look like.
Fascinating is a fascinating word to use in that situation. Before we've got a lot of things that I'm sure we are going to discuss that are not so great about this team, that need some improvement, that needs some fixing. But on the outside looking in as well, and just kind of what you've seen, is there anything that you are excited about for this team moving forward? Any positives that we can take away from what we've seen through 13 games so far?
Well, I think just collectively, I'm excited about change. I don't think this is in a current state that you could just, quote, run it back, or
Right.
let's re-rack and get healthy and let's see where the cards fall next season. This team needs some changes. I'm excited for change, and that's kind of a collective cop-out, but I'm excited for change.
That's a really good answer. I think the 2023 offseason is going to be a franchise altering offseason one way or the other, because let's just say, for devil's advocate's sake, that they don't do what you're saying and they don't make a ton of changes and they try to run this back and borrow more money from the future and come back with an Aaron Rodgers and all the sort of the same stuff. They're not going to be able to do it to the same degree. They're going to lose some players even doing that. But that is still a franchise altering decision in trying to, force this window open a sliver for a year or two longer, which in my opinion is probably the worst thing that they can possibly do. That to me is still a franchise altering decision. If they go in the opposite direction and say, hey, we need a major Band-Aid rip and we need to start getting our salary cap back under control. We need to start playing some younger players. We need to get some assets in here that can be, long-term players for us. That is a franchise altering move. And if they go somewhere in the middle and maybe it's like, hey, we're going to go to Jordan Love, but we still want to keep all of this together, or we're going to keep Aaron Rodgers, but we're going to try to surround him with youth. Even that to me is somewhat of a franchise altering decision. So either way, to me, this is a major franchise altering offseason for Green Bay.
And I think a lot of times, Andy, we talk about, veteran players on the backside of their career, and then the whole idea of signing them being a year early or a year late. That's talking about their diminishing ability, where you'd rather see that a year ahead than go through that growing pain year of realizing they can't play anymore. I think, contending windows have that same conversation. Would you rather be a year early on that or a year late on that? Because if you're a year late, that just means you're one more year behind the 8 ball in rebuilding, retooling, and starting that cycle all over again.
Totally agreed. And you could make an argument they're already a year late, and trying to extend this further would now set them 2 years late, 3 years late, etc. So
exactly.
Going to be a very interesting offseason. I want to go back to your conversation a little bit earlier about the defensive issues, because that's clearly one of the major issues. I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that this would be a team that I would at least have a chance to compete as being a top 10 defense. I would be willing to give them a little bit more of a cop out if Rashawn Gary was lost early in the season, or like even if it was, week 10, he goes down and they were looking like a top 10 defense prior to that, but they weren't. And then Rashawn Gary goes down, things get even worse after that. This is not a defense that has been up to the standard that I think we were expecting. You mentioned it's a little bit personnel. You mentioned that it's a little bit scheme. What to you has been the biggest issue with this defense this season?
It's a combination of everything. I think we want to point to a singular issue, and there rarely is in these situations. So that's one of the more coveted and desired things from fans on the outside of these conversations is what's wrong, and it's a singular thing. It's a lot of different things. There's multiple things, maybe double-digit things. So, we could talk ad nauseum about it, but I think you set it up a lot. I think, there was some diminishing ability from veterans like Campbell and, Adrian Amos. There were some young players with growing pains on the fly, whether, a Stokes, Devontae Wyatt, Quay Walker, guys like that. The injuries, obviously. And then just expectations, guys like Jair Alexander, you expect guys like that to be reliable, to be consistent, to maybe not always give you an A performance, but you're never going to get a C performance out of him. Yeah. And that's what you want when you pay these stars is, yes, we hope for those A flashes. Don't you dare ever go below a B minus, though. And you had way too much fluctuation from players that were never questioned on whether they were going to be starters or involved or major factors on this team. Talked about the offensive guys. Same thing on defense. It goes for Savage. It goes for Amos. It goes for the linebackers. It goes for the corners. The D line is kind of a rotational ball of clay, and it's a kind of a work in progress with some young guys and vets and things like that. But that back seven was incredibly disappointing this year.
I think that maybe the easier way to put it is it'd be a lot harder to point to something on defense that's going right, right? Like on the defensive line, you're not holding up at the point of attack in the run game. You're not getting pressure on the interior at edge. Rashawn Gary going out certainly hurt things, but there were some edge issues even in the run game prior to that. And then without Gary, Preston, and Igbare, you'll see a flash every now and again, but you're not certainly getting consistent pressure on the outside. Inside linebackers haven't held up at the point of attack. You saw diminishing returns from Campbell, as you mentioned. Corners on the I mean, then week one, Minnesota, you're going against Justin Jefferson and company. You're not communicating on the back end at all to pass off things and to just have a common level of communication where you can play defense in a zone the way that you want to. We see the same things pop up against the Titans. We see the same thing pop up against the Eagles in week 12, week 11, week 13, etc., where those things aren't improving. Adrian Amos looks a step slower. Savage just never came to the plate and stepped up this season at all. And then the scheme too, like, there's certain things on the scheme that you see that you just don't like. I think when you had pointed it out early in the season where it took them like a month before they blitzed somebody from depth. And yeah, there was maybe some 5-man rushes where they had 5 guys at the line of scrimmage, but wasn't really a true blitz. And it was some of the most vanilla football you could possibly imagine, just trying to win with 4 guys. You always make the comment of like, offense doesn't need to be hard, right? Sometimes on defense, like, maybe it's not like it doesn't have to be hard, but like you can't simplify it to the level of just like the offense knows what's coming every single time. And you're like, it was just as vanilla and bland as you could possibly imagine. There's just so many things that you could point to defensively. And I don't think I can point to one of them of like, I feel pretty good about that moving forward.
Yeah, and I actually like vanilla bland, but in a slightly different package. And I think the best defenses around the league are playing very vanilla schemes, but getting to it very exotically and disguising things. And that's really the name of the game, is preventing big plays, playing cover 2, keep it in front of you, but just trying to disguise looks. And, maybe it's a 4-man rush, but you're not always bringing the same 4 and they come from different spots. And that's how Tennessee plays. That's how Cincy plays. That's how a lot of these really strong veteran disciplined units play across the league. I'm okay with that, but you got to be a little exotic. You got to move things around, change post-snap pictures. But starting week 1 with, confusions on the back end, they didn't earn the right to disguise things. They had to recalibrate, get on the same page, and almost dumb themselves down a little bit. And then the next thing you know, they're vanilla pre-snap into vanilla post-snap, and suddenly you're sitting there with a bowl of melted ice cream.
I also think Green Bay needs to do a little bit better of a job of marrying the personnel with the scheme, meaning that I'm with you. I don't mind playing, 2 safeties high and keeping everything in front of you. You better have players who can tackle on the back end. And you've got a Darnell Savage and a Jair Alexander and an Eric Stokes starting on your defensive secondary, that none of which are strong tacklers on the back end. Adrian Amos, a step slower, not getting to his spots. It's not a team that rallies to the football very, very well. Like, if you're going to be a C player, go hit player team, you better have C player, go hit player players. And they're just not married up very well right now.
Yeah, you see that on a weekly basis. And a lot of that starts with your stars, the guys you've paid money. And it starts with guys like Jair Alexander and Adrian Amos and Darnell Savage and first-round picks. And play a quarter scheme like that, and you have forced corners out there and safeties flying down at run support. I promise you, Packers fans, go on PFF, go watch every 15-plus yard play this season in the run game and see where a player could have made the tackle because he was unblocked. Promise you, you'll be shocked at some of the players that it was, and you'll be shocked at just how disappointing you'll be in the effort and the execution, the technique of some cornerstone veteran players that you might be wearing their jersey while you're watching it, for all I know. It's those types of players, and that disappoints you and really sets your team back to be competitive.
Your stars need to be stars, and Green
No
Bay Stars
question.
have
Well
not
said.
been that. You've had the opportunity to be very close to a Philadelphia Eagles team that has been highly successful this season. And as mentioned earlier, you're always keeping tabs on the trends around the league. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in the NFL this year from some of the highly successful football teams? And then maybe balance that out with some of the things that we haven't seen from the Packers this year.
Well, from a big picture standpoint and, roster building, it's a 365, 24/7 job to constantly improve your roster. And there are a few people and teams that do it better than Howie Roseman and the Eagles here. So one of the more active GMs and, personnel executives out there, not only in the season, off season, trading, acquiring future talent, looking to improve your roster every day of his life. And you really see it and you feel it. And this roster in 2022 reflects it. And it's just a never sleep type of job. And I think a lot of the teams around the league do that, whether it's Buffalo or Kansas City's making moves, in the middle of the season to get stronger and fix holes on their roster. San Francisco is very aware they need weapons around those quarterbacks. And if you see a sniff of a weapon out there, let's go get them and make our team better. So it's that constant aggressive approach to make your roster better. Now, the other side of that, they make mistakes too. Every team makes mistakes. Every team makes personnel, decisions that don't work out. But the timeline in which you fix those mistakes is different for everybody. Some want to hold on to that and mold it and shove that square peg through the round hole by all means. And it may take 3, 4, 5 years because you want to commit to it. Bit of the sunken costs and that you're already committed. You might as well, try to get the payoff on ROI on the back end. Some teams can see it and then let's snip and cut bait as soon as we can. And I just feel in Green Bay, this has not been a team that's been particularly aggressive for roster improvements and not particularly aggressive to fix mistakes when they seemingly don't make the right decision or the right signing. So you let some of those things fester, and that can really set your team back to the point when there are mistakes being made in Green Bay. I don't know where the accountability lies. I don't know who the decision maker is to get out from those potential missteps, from the GM to the president to the coach to the players. I have no idea how Green Bay operates. In my head, Andy, it's like 8 power people, and they're all at the same table saying, how do we fix this? Someone has to fire themselves, apparently. So I see some guys that have not performed to particularly my standards and the reflection of NFL standards across the league. I just do not know what the accountability hierarchy is in Green Bay to fix mistakes when they happened. And there are a lot of mistakes with this team.
There is. I think on the second part of that, I think a great example is Darnell Savage, right? Like former first-round pick, all had high hopes for him, really struggles this past season in 2021 under Joe Barry. Thought he had an okay 2020. And then they have the 5th-year option, and they decide to pick it up. And now you bench him basically right before he gets hurt this year. They end up benching him, making him basically the dime defensive back. And now he's guaranteed all next year. His full salary is guaranteed. The only way you can basically get out of that is by trading him. You're probably going to have to add draft capital on top of that to get out of that salary. That is a massive sunken cost. I didn't like the 5th-year option at the time. It looks even worse now. And that's one of those of like, hey, we spent the 1st-round pick on him and we want to try to get the ROI. We think he can be a good player. And he just hasn't shown that. And he's been wildly inconsistent, never really earning that. And then when you give a player a 5th-year guarantee deal going into his 4th season, when he's coming off a poor 3rd year, like what incentive does he have to improve in his 4th year? He's like, oh, well, I must be doing a good job because I just got my 5th year guaranteed, when it was actually quite the opposite. I was a little bit hopeful. I mean, hopeful is the wrong word, but like I was at least happy to see, even though it took too long, that they moved on from Amari Rodgers midseason, that maybe there's at least some willingness to do that. But even that took his 5th fumble on.
Yeah,
on
that's
team?
not like something I'm patting the team on the back.
Agreed.
Because they finally
agreed.
Finally were fed up with it. We're all sitting here saying that should have been a month ago or in the offseason.
Totally agreed. And then on the flip side, what you mentioned at the onset, Like, how many times have we seen Green Bay do something like the Eagles have done where, all right, defensive line's getting beat up a little bit. You know what? Not only we're going to go get Ndamukong Suh, we're going to get Linval Joseph. We're going to bring in 2 guys that have veteran experience. Will it work out? Don't know. Maybe they're going to be rusty. Maybe they're not going to be the same players they were, but we're going to try. We're going to try something different. We're going to get 2 veterans in. Green Bay's never done anything like that when they've had the opportunities even in must-win.
They traded for Robert Quinn in September. They traded for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson a week before the season. You know, yeah.
Like, you do those things. The Buffalo Bills, right? They would, I'm sure, love to have a little bit more explosivity on offense, even though they have a Stephon Diggs, even though they've got some explosive playmakers. What do they do just recently? They bring John Brown to the practice squad. They bring Cole Beasley to the practice squad. Maybe neither of those guys works out.
Traded for Nyheim Hines last month.
Exactly, right? They go
when they drafted James Cook and they have Devin Singletary. Nobody said, "Oh, we already have 2 running backs." Nobody cares. Add weapons around your superstar quarterback.
And especially when you have the opportunity to go out and win a Super Bowl. I'm not saying Green Bay necessarily should have done that this year. In fact, one of the most concerning things to me is that they almost gave up probably what amounts to an early 2nd-round pick for Chase Claypool when this season was already a sunken cost. That would have been one of the worst things that could have happened. But yeah, like, they had those opportunities in the last 3 years. They didn't really pounce on them when they should have. If they could have gone all in the 2 of the previous seasons, and yeah, they would have been in a worse situation in 2022. That's okay. They're already in a bad situation in 2022. I would rather have had you go and get a couple more playmakers in 2020 and 2021 that maybe could have got them over the top against Tampa Bay and San Francisco, and maybe make a run in those years, and still be a little bit worse this year. That's fine. No big deal. No harm, no foul. But it feels like, unfortunately, that window has passed.
Yeah, you could have made an offer for Amari Cooper, a year and a half ago. You could have went and got a Juju and, gave him a little extra money in free agency. There's players out there, to make aggressive strides. I feel like Green Bay has always been the bargain buyer in free agency, and you fall into some good ones. Adrian Amos, great. He worked out for a few years. Avondre Campbell, huge season last year. That's great. Preston Smith, they were never the coveted free agents of the class. It always seems like we're looking for that B-style free agent, and all of these were free agent type of conversations we just had. I'm not trying to go through the draft pick by draft pick type of a, analysis and post-mortem, but there's been some very interesting drafts as well. And it's a philosophical thing on how do you evaluate the draft? Do you evaluate the misses or the hits? I'm a misses type of guy, and I don't want to do a pick by pick. Oh, they could have had him. Not many people in the league had Sean Runyon as a 3rd-round pick. Not a lot of people had A.J. Dillon as a 2nd-round pick. Not a lot of teams pick punters and long snappers in the same draft. Not a lot of teams trade up for a quarterback, after an NFC Championship appearance. Things like that. There's some very interesting decisions as well. Not a lot of people go 24-year-old defensive lineman and an off-ball linebacker in the 1st round last year with a contending team, and then trade up for a receiver. And you could look at all the moves they could have made. I don't know if I want to go down that road, but I think we're just poking and prodding at the inconsistency and the lack of aggressiveness to build this roster in a 365 24/7 capacity. And it's in comparison to the teams that are doing it. And there's a gold standard set, and everything is a reflection on the gold standard in this league.
Well, there's good news. I did that episode earlier this week of breaking down the draft and what they could have done.
Great.
So we already got that taken care of. But I do want to ask you just kind of your overarching thoughts on this draft class. 1st-round picks, as you mentioned, maybe not so great. 2nd round, Christian Watson has certainly been performing well as of late. Romeo Doubs shown flashes, Zach Tom shown flashes, and Igbare shown flashes. What's your overall take on this draft class so far, even though it's still very early?
Yeah, you literally just went right down my list right there. And Igbare, nice day 3 rusher, 4th, 5th defensive end in a group. And I think that's what you want for a guy coming off the bench. Instant quarterback hunting, energy, effort. He's an infectious presence that you want in day 3. Great pick. Zach Tom, nice piece, versatile. We've seen his ability to play different spots. Let's keep him on the edge at tackle. So he's a nice piece. Christian Watson, nice speed piece. We'll see if he could come into being an every down type of receiver at all 3 levels. Quay and Devontae Wyatt and the Georgia boys, a little overdrafted in my opinion, a little disappointing for their production and their impacts. We already touched on the Sean Ryan picks and, other things like that. I hope for Romeo Doubs and Samari Toure to fill out the receiver room, but it has to be a balance. And as you bring up the youth, you better compound that with some veteran presence. The Sammy Watkins experiment didn't work out. Okay. We kind of move on from here. So there's some nice players. I see some flashes of some really strong play. Christian Watson looks like he could be a game-breaking type of player. In my opinion, is he closer to Devontae Adams or an MVS? Probably going to be an MVS type of player. But it's not to say he can't be an all-world game-breaking receiver. I don't particularly see that, and that's okay. There's a place for a speed dynamic over the top threat or a, put the ball in his hands threat. Really excited for what he's shown this year.
Yeah, I think there's some things to be excited about, but it's going to take time to develop these players, and it's going to take consistency. I just go back to Eric Stokes in 2021, who showed some serious flashes, and then 2022 it came out and didn't really do much, prior to getting hurt. So
Right.
You can't just do it 1 year. You can't just do it for 4 games. You have to, as Mike McCarthy liked to say, stack success over and over and become a consistent player. That's when you can start getting, compared to some of the Devontae Adamses and things like that in the league. You just got to do it on almost an every week basis. Real quick, your thoughts on we talked about this offseason being a potential just franchise altering offseason. They've got maybe the biggest challenge or decision that you could possibly have with 2 quarterbacks in Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. Jordan Love now having the 5th-year option come up this offseason. He's going to want to at least have the opportunity to start somewhere. If not in Green Bay, the report is he may ask for a trade. And then, of course, you've got Aaron Rodgers, who hasn't really played up to his, MVP standard, even the game manager MVP standard this year. But a lot of that was what was surrounded him. Some of the injuries played a part as well. What do you do going forward, Ben?
It's a fascinating team. When you drafted Jordan Love, Aaron Rodgers had no power. That's when he said the whole future's not up to me, I guess. You just took a first-round quarterback, traded up. That typically means you're going to him at some point. Then you extend Rodgers with really no out. Now Jordan Love has no future with this team. So essentially being held hostage. His career has been held hostage for 4 years. Yep. And that's what I meant 2 years ago. I don't know if I was talking to you or Peter about Aaron Rodgers also advocating for Jordan Love through his through the whole dysfunction of the team, because Aaron Rodgers knows this young 21, 22-year-old quarterback thinks he could play in this league. Teams wanted this kid, and now we're sitting him behind me. No, he's not playing ahead of me as long as I'm here. So who's it going to be? Why did you take this kid then? And now we're sitting here 3-4 years later saying, where is this all going? Because Aaron Rodgers has a huge number for next year the team can't get out of unless he retires. So it's trade Rodgers, wait for him to retire, come back with him next year. Then what do you do with Jordan Love? You're going to have a first-round quarterback you traded up for that's been on ice for 4 or 5 years. You pick up his option? I don't know what to do with this situation. And you could foresee this down the road, from them making this decision. And, it's going to be a rough offseason. This might be a blow-up offseason, too, because the high-dollar players, Kenny Clark, Bakhtiari, Jair Alexander, Aaron Jones, they might not all be here next year. Agreed. And, based on their age and play and impact and, presence and personalities, not a lot of people want to pay a nose tackle. Not a lot of people think, Bakhtiari has anything left. Not a lot of people think Aaron Jones is worthy of that contract. Jair obviously didn't live up to it. And they have to pay Rashawn Gary. I think they have to pay Elton Jenkins. So there's some really tough decisions coming down the pipe here. Fans may not like it. There's a lot of really good people. I love Aaron Jones. I love Kenny Clark. There's a chance they're not here next year. And that's the reality of this league. And that should be a good thing to Packers fans. There's some Band-Aids that need to be ripped off, and there's going to be some arm hair coming with it. So rip that thing off as hard as you can, and let's start moving towards the future and fixing this with change. And change is needed.
I've said for a while now, it feels like it's going to have to get a lot worse before it can get better. And you just have to take your medicine. And like you said, that we talked about a little bit ago, I think the worst thing this team could do is try to do this again. It did not go anywhere near according to plan this year, and trying to do that again in 2023 is probably by far and away the worst case scenario. So there's going to be some pain along the way, but they're going to have to take their medicine and rip the Band-Aid, whatever metaphor you want to use, get over it and start that, whether it's a soft rebuild, a hard rebuild, doesn't matter. I don't care. But they got to start somewhere, and it has to start this offseason. All right, Ben, we talked about some of the diagnosis, some of the things that are wrong. We talked about some of the things that they're probably going to need to fix moving forward. Any other things that you think that this team needs to address, or any other final thoughts before we get out of here and watch 4 more games of this Packers team before we move on to a crazy offseason?
Collectively, I think they need a true presence on the football side for management. I don't think that's Mark Murphy. I think there's too many people sitting at the table of leadership without somebody authoritative over top of that boardroom. Unfortunately, I think there's some big names and big heads that have to fall. I think the GM may be a candidate to go. I think the defensive coordinator could be a candidate to go. I don't know who makes those decisions. And that's not, and I know this is coming out, that's not how we do things. Has always been the moniker out of the front office. This is how we do things in Green Bay. We do things differently. So I don't know what to make of this. Could this year be that one, earthquake to rattle their way of doing things? Change is needed. And I look forward to the future. I look forward to the strides and moves they make in those potential changes, and we'll evaluate them accordingly. This is a fascinating team for a variety of reasons we just listed: roster, front office, players, coaches, management, things like that. It's a fascinating team. I don't have a whole lot of answers, but I am excited. I have my popcorn ready to follow this ride.
There's a lot of questions. There's not a ton of answers. You can see me smiling from ear to ear because I love this stuff. Like,
Me
I know,
too. Yeah.
people have asked me, they're like, oh, this must suck covering the team right now because they're 4 or 5-8 and like there's not much like hope and people are probably not. I'm like, dude, like this stuff is super fun. Like this is really intriguing to me because this is where like you get some of these major shifts in organizational structure and who does. And like when you have so much invested into a team and it doesn't go according to plan and you don't get the ROI that you were expected, something went wrong. And that means either the evaluation of the players that you paid all the money to and gave a bunch of first round picks for didn't go right, which means that your GM got things wrong, which means you need to change a GM, or the players were right. You made the right evaluations and the coaches didn't get the most out of those players that you made the right evaluations on. And that means the coaches need to change, right? And it's probably somewhere in the middle, as it always is. It's probably some on the GM, some on the coaches. But when you put so much in to this team and you don't get the results, man, something has to change, right? Like you said, change. It's the key word I think that we're taking away from today. But no, I am geeked out to see what transpires over this next however long it takes, because the decisions on some of their free agents, their decisions on some of their key players, quarterback, GM, defensive coordinator, how this team looks in 2023 compared to what they are right now, massively interesting to me. And I couldn't be more excited.
It's why sports are so much fun to evaluate. It's a machine, and it's the people building the team. It's the coaches orchestrating the players performing. Where do you divvy up the credit? You look last year. Do you give the credit to LaFleur or to Rodgers? You could still argue that. It's a fun conversation. Same thing goes for, when things go wrong. Who do you pit the accountability to? It's rarely a singular thing like we always keep harping on. But remember, fans live in the world of wins and losses. It affects their Monday when they have losses and they're angry. We live in the world of analysis. If they're 0-16, some fascinating things to talk about. 0-16.
Agreed.
If they're 16-0, there's some fascinating things. So the emotionality of fans is where things go sour when you have seasons like this. When you're in the business of wins and losses, yeah, those losses aren't fun days. So we like to say we're in the business of analysis, and we're always just going to give you a snapshot of what we're seeing in the picture. And there's always pictures and themes and conversations and avenues to evaluate. And none of that ends. You want to talk about Bill Walsh or Joe Montana when we get off the call, we can still have that conversation. So that's why sports and football in particular, it's just great chatter.
And we'll end with this, but that's why the offseason in the NFL is king, right? Because when you have a 17-game season and you start off like 2-4, you're already like, all right, I'm like, I don't even know like what I want to put into this season. But immediately that season ends and you've got from whatever, January, whatever, up until September, whatever, where hope just springs eternal. And you immediately turn the page as a fan and you start getting excited for, all right, what can we get in free agency? And what can we get in the draft? And what's the new defensive coordinator look like? And, oh, we got a new inside linebackers coach. What is that going to mean? And like everything is just hope. And then all of a sudden you get to 2-4 and you're like, all right, like everyone needs to get fired, and it just the whole cycle starts over. It's a fun process. I love it, Ben, and I love.
Hey, the off season festers and blossoms optimism, And
Exactly.
I think when you get to this point in December, you're just scratching and clawing to get to that off season and have that spring blooming and everything's nice.
Agreed.
And you're undefeated in training camp and everything looks good in August. And then the bolts start flying. You say, what the heck is going on out here, guys? What are we preparing for? We got so-and-so on the front lines. We got no artillery. We got a poor plan here. What were we thinking? It's like, sometimes you need some live bullets and to get punched in the face to realize you have a glass jaw.
And you need to make some changes. Ben, amazing stuff as always. You can follow Ben on Twitter at @BenFennell_NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. You can follow me at Andy Herman NFL. That's going to do it for us today. Ben, anything you want to plug on the way out?
No, not particularly. Keep following along our Philadelphia Eagles season here, Packers fans, as that season in Green Bay is probably coming to a close here. I'm going to be heading over to NFL Network next month to continue my draft coverage with Daniel Jeremiah, the Senior Bowl, the Combine Draft. Always looking ahead to the next class. I know Packers fans may be peeking ahead, so be sure to check out my timeline on Twitter and all the content draft related. It's coming soon.
Are you still doing a lot with Journey to the Draft podcast too?
Yep, weekly with Fran Duffy here at the Philadelphia Eagles, Dane Brugler,
So
some good guests on a week-to-week basis. I know Packers fans don't love listening to those draft podcasts in November, December, but pick it up. It's a fun class. There should be some players and parts to help us out next year.
They might be a little bit more willing in 2022 than they were in 2019 through 2021, to say the least. But
where do they stand with the first round pick right now? Like 11, 12, 13, probably early teens.
14 is the most recent. I think they
perfect,
were
right in no man's land, right in no man's land.
Big
Great.
Time. I mentioned if all the Vegas favorites win from here on out, they will finish a game out of the playoffs with the 16th pick in the draft, which is just the chef kiss worst thing that can possibly happen, of course. But we'll see. Maybe they go 1-4, maybe they go 4-0. That is another interesting part of the season. But Ben, great stuff as always. Again, make sure to follow everything Ben does. But that does it for us today. Until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.